Hi, and welcome to Mrs. Long's video lesson on William Blake's poem, The Garden of Love. I'd like you to pay special attention to the image on this first slide to see the children enjoying being outside in a garden. This becomes a very important idea. So let's have a look at a reading of the poem, and you can follow along with the text on your right.
The Garden of Love by William Blake. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play on the green. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love that so many sweet flowers bore. And I saw it was filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds, and binding with briars my joys and desires.
Okay. So our poet is William Blake, and he came to be known as a bit of a nonconformist. He often used to write and concern himself with social injustice, and he was also a spiritual man, a spiritual thinker. You may have encountered Blake before in a poem called The Tiger. A lot of schools do that in grade 8 or 9. And that poem comes from a collection of poems written by Blake called The Songs of Innocence and Experience. And so it's a collection of poems written. The Songs of Innocence are poems that focus on childhood, purity, harmony, happiness, all of the things that you would experience when you are young and innocent and wide-eyed. And then the Songs of Experience look at the world through a lens of somebody who's been through it all, seen it all, and is now questioning asking the big questions in life, and sometimes the uncomfortable questions about human nature and evil in the world. And so this poem is a poem of experience, and it chiefly on the surface seems to be a poem about visiting a place one went when one was small, but actually what Blake is doing is he's making a comment about religion and the power that religion has over society. So although he was a deeply religious man, he did question the control that the church had over society and felt that the church as an institution and God did not really align with each other. And the church was wielding power over society and not actually instilling values that God and spiritualism itself hold dear. Let's have a look at the way the poem is structured. So you've got 3 stanzas of 4 lines each, and in the first stanza you've got your speaker who goes into this place they refer to as the Garden of Love. It's a place that was familiar with their, something that somewhere they used to go when they were a child, but now they find that a chapel has been built in the middle of this big area of greenery. In the second stanza, the speaker encounters the gates of this chapel are shut and no one is allowed to enter. And so the speaker turns to the Garden of Love, but instead of flowers, it's now filled with graves. And has it been a place inhabited by priests walking around rather ominously in their black garb? And they are binding with briars my joys and desires. We'll have a closer look at that line later on. I want you quickly to pay attention to the rhyme scheme. You've got a very rhythmic rhyme scheme and very simplistic poem on the surface, simple images. And so we've got this almost sing-song nursery rhyme feel of A, B, C, B, A, B, C, B. But note how the rhyme scheme changes in the third stanza, A, B, C, D, perhaps bringing a note of finality and sort of symbolizing how the poem, the speaker has moved away from this predictable way of looking at the world to perhaps something a little bit more unpredictable and ominous. So let's have a look at the first stanza. I went to the Garden of Love. Notice the capitalization there of Garden of Love. This is the title of a place. It's also an allusion to the Garden of Eden, and you'll see that this poem, because it's essentially a comment about religion, there are lots of allusions to the church. This garden, as we said, on the surface, it could just be a physical place. It could also be a spiritual manifestation, or a place where the person feels comfortable, and a symbol of innocence and the pure joy found in life. So when our speaker gets there, he sees that this garden has changed. So there's something new here, and something he never had seen. That never is quite a powerful negative word. And so it sets us up to believe that this is a completely new manifestation. A chapel, obviously a very simple and powerful symbol of religion, is capitalized as well, showing the domination that this chapel has over this place. It's in the midst of the green. The midst is in the middle. It's dominating, it's imposing over this area where the speaker used to play. So we've got this immediate idea that this chapel is in a place where the speaker experienced joy and love and childhood innocence, but we now have this big foreboding building in the middle of it. So what we're dealing with in this first stanza is the idea that the innocence of the world and the enjoyment that man had with nature has been interrupted or imposed upon by this chapel, which represents institution of religion, this very physical manifestation of the power of the church in the world. So the speaker encounters this chapel, but is not able to enter because the gates are shut. And this kind of goes against what many people think of religion as then and both now as this place of welcoming, because the gates are shut and no one is allowed to enter. So you get the feeling that access to this place is only specific to a certain group of people at certain times. And we've got this great allusion to the Old Testament commandments, thou shalt not, in other words, you shall not enter. But we know that the other commandments, thou shalt not lie, steal, covet thy neighbor's goods, commit adultery, etc. And the focus there, of course, is on the power that religion has to control people's behavior, as opposed to the idea of love and acceptance. So in a moment of still seeking the solace of this garden of love that the speaker experienced in his youth, it used to be a place of sweet flowers. He turned there. So this could be a physical turning, if we're looking at an actual garden, or it could be an emotional choice to seek out this place of innocence and joy and love. Obviously, sweet flowers, we associate flowers with new life, beauty, nature, and if we're talking about a garden, these flowers remind him of a place of a happy youth. So again, the idea being manifested here is that the church has imposed a set of controls or restrictions over people's lives. You aren't just free to come and go into a place that used to be accessible to everybody. Our final stanza starts off with this idea that the speakers turned to the Garden of Love, so they turned away from the chapel to seek out the little bit of greenery left, and instead of being filled with flowers, it is filled with graves. Obviously a very powerful image of death, lack of life. It's an uncomfortable image. It's somber and foreboding. So we've got these tombstones where flowers should be. in essence, death has replaced life. And instead of children running around laughing, playing, as that image that I draw your attention to at the beginning of the video, we now have priests. Again, this is a capitalized because it's a symbol of the power of the institution. And the priests represent the church as a whole. And they are walking around in black gowns. Okay, we've talked about graves and tombstones. Now we've got a further image that reminds us of death in the black. It's not a comforting image. And these priests are walking their rounds. Some lovely internal rhyme here, perhaps to compensate for the lack of the rhyme scheme in this stanza. And what are the priests doing? Well, they are binding with briars my joys and desires. Binding, restricting, and the briars, that thorny bush or thorny greenery, is also, I think, an allusion to the crown of thorns that Christ wore on the cross. So instead of a place where natural joys and desires, love, lust, maybe even, the church is now imposing rules and curbing people's ability to experience this happiness. It's an often mentioned interpretation of this poem is that Blake was referring specifically to the marriage laws and how religion was taking control over people's ability to express who they could love, how they could express their love for one another. Okay, so instead of this beautiful garden of flowers, we've now got this churchyard that is filled with tombs and death instead of life and love. So let's look a little bit more closely at the main images in this poem. We've got our garden, reminiscent of the Garden of Eden, which in the speaker's youth was natural, beautiful, left to open for everyone to access. We've also got the associations of gardens with fertility, a place where things grow freely, and flowers, of course, are often compared to the sexual organs. We think about fertility there as well. So all of the things that are allowed to go unheeded and just have fruitful expression. Of course, until the fall, the Garden of Eden was innocent until the fall, until man chose to disobey God and then were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. It makes us think of this, thou shalt not. So there's another way of looking at the garden and the religious imagery and references in the poem. The chapel and the priests represent the complete opposite of this garden. They're not naturally part of the rules of the landscape. They aren't there to represent freedom and love and life and growth, but they represent rules and restrictions. Thou shalt not. The chapel doors are shut. The focus in this kind of organized religion is on obedience instead of freedom, and it's not something that everyone is allowed to access, unlike a garden. So we can see here that Blake is making a very clear comment about what he feels are the downfalls, the pitfalls of organized religion over spirituality and love. So remember that you can look at this poem on the surface as a little narrative of somebody going to an actual garden and experiencing being restricted from accessing it because of a building that has been placed there, or as Blake probably intended, this more metaphorical interpretation of the limitations that the church and organized structures of religion are placing on the natural life, love, and desires of the community. Thank you.